Okay, is the mic on already? Sounds like it. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm happy to see so many people here, especially on a rainy day. And thanks also to everybody who is watching on the live stream. I'm Sarah Reber, Senior Fellow in the Center for Economic Security and Opportunity, CASO. And I want to thank you all for coming. And I'm excited to share some findings from a new report out today, Helping Students to and Through College, What Does the Evidence Say? I had a lot of help with this work. So before I get started, I want to thank the interns and research assistants who contributed to this effort. Gabby Goodman, Simon Hodson, Pratap Khatri, Emma Phillips, and Jonathan Zars. Thank you guys so much for all the hard work. Also, as part of this effort, we convened several panels of researchers who work in this area. And I really learned a lot from these discussions. They were also a lot of fun. There were a lot of insights that came out of those discussions. Not everything made it into the report, but I'm really grateful to the participants for taking the time and sharing their expertise. I won't list them out here, but you can find them in the acknowledgements to the report. Okay, so let me get started. So completing a college degree is the most reliable pathway to upward mobility and economic stability. We're seeing the public lose some faith in the idea that college is worth it, but I think the evidence still strongly supports this idea. But access to college is unequal. In particular, gaps in college enrollment and completion by socioeconomic status are very large, and they're not wholly explained by differences in academic preparation, although that is an important contributing factor. Many students struggle to complete college. A little less than 2/3 of students who start in a four-year degree program complete that degree within 6 years. And for students starting in two-year degree programs, only about 1/3 complete their two-year degree in 3 years. And students who complete some college but don't get a degree have poor student loan and financial outcomes. So this raises questions about how we can support students, especially students from disadvantaged backgrounds, to enroll in college and complete their degrees. So in this report, we ask what research says about promising strategies to improve college success and completion. And I'll just say about terminology, I'll use access, which in this context typically refers to enrolling in college either shortly after high school or later on. And I'll use completion and success somewhat interchangeably, although there are obviously other definitions of success besides completing a degree. So many factors affect whether someone enrolls in college and completes their degree. So the first question is, well, what set of studies should we be thinking about if the question is, how do we improve access and completion? And this was actually like a big topic of discussion in the with the expert meetings that we held of, what should we think about including here. And in the report, I report some findings from some related literatures, but today I'm going to focus on interventions, studies of interventions that are specifically designed to increase college enrollment or completion. There are many such interventions that have been developed and tested over the last couple of decades, and I'll focus on interventions that have been evaluated with strong causal studies, mostly RCTs, but there's a few strong quasi-experimental studies. So then we'll ask what lessons we can draw from this evidence for practice, for policy, and for research. And there's a lot in the report, and I hope you'll all find it on the Brookings website and dig in later. So just a quick roadmap of what I'll do in my 20 minutes here. So first I'm going to talk about, sort of what types of interventions I'm talking about. It's helpful to group them a little bit, and so we put them into these three categories. I think I might have driven my research assistants a little crazy classifying and reclassifying the intervention, so there's like a lot of slippage, but also I'll talk about each of these three categories of interventions and what the sort of high-level takeaways from the research are. Then I'll talk about three lessons that I took away from this work. There are about a dozen or so in the report, so I'll just focus on a few here. A few brief thoughts on promising areas for future work, and then some concluding thoughts. Okay, so the first category of interventions that we looked at is what I'll call advisors or navigators. So these are interventions where you have an advisor, a navigator, a counselor, a mentor, or a coach who works directly with students one-on-one, or in a group. These advisors might be professional advisors. They might work full-time, they might work part-time, they might be near-peer advisors, upperclassmen working with lowerclassmen. So there's a wide range of how these programs are staffed. There's also a wide range of activities that that advisors do with students. So they might help with college applications in an access intervention. There are coaching interventions for college success, where they might try to help students develop time management and study skills. Very commonly, advisors will provide help with academic and career planning. And in some interventions, the advisor will connect students with other resources, and that might be on campus or more broadly in the community. So there's a very wide range of costs in this among these interventions, mostly reflecting staffing and intensity of the advising. And just to paint with an incredibly broad brush, I would say that many of these interventions have modest positive effects. Now I'm going to make a little bit of a annoying technical point, which is to say that there are a lot of studies in this literature where the sample is kind of such that modest effects are not statistically significant. And so we kind of end up in a situation of, it's not that the intervention doesn't work, but we don't know really whether the intervention works based on the evidence we have. And in our review, we tried to be very careful to this distinction. But I think that if you look across the literature, it's sort of very suggestive that advising interventions can help, but there is, of course, a lot of variation. So the next category is comprehensive programs, and these are programs that have multiple components to address a broad range of personal, financial, and other needs that students might have, either for access or for completion. And I'll just, by example, talk about the CUNY ASAP program, which is really, I think, the exemplar in this category. And in that program, participants received academic and career advising, tutoring, last dollar financial aid that covered any gap between the cost of attendance and the financial aid they might be getting from other sources. They got a Metro card. They had help with books. They had some priority in registration and more. So this is a very comprehensive approach. And ASAP and a few other comprehensive approaches have shown substantial effects on completion, so nearly doubling completion rates in a community college setting. They've also have been evaluated in a four-year setting in the CUNY system as well. And importantly, these comprehensive approaches have strong effects across settings and across subgroups. I'll come back to this a little bit. So finally, the last group is what I'll call low-touch interventions. This is sort of a catch-all for low-cost and easily scalable approaches to increasing access and completion. So a lot of this is information, reminders, or nudges where the intervention uses typically a low-cost technology like text messaging or email, or sometimes they might use the US mail, but these interventions are quite cheap at scale. And what we've learned from this, I think, is that with few exceptions, information on its own is not doing very much. Nudges and reminders can help students complete clear, time-limited tasks, like completing a form, for example. And there's some interesting findings, I think, from these goal-setting experiments where in a success context where the intervention tries to help students make academic goals. And I think there's some evidence that the task-based approach where students make goals about, I'm going to complete this many assignments or I'm going to study this much, rather than outcome-based goals where they make a goal that's like, I'm going to get a such and such grade in the class, that the task-based approach is more effective. But I would say that across these nudges, reminders, task-based, or these goal-setting interventions, sometimes you'll see movement on intermediate outcomes, but it's rare to see sort of much of a downstream effect on persistence or completion. But I think there are insights from this work that could be incorporated into the development of other advising or more comprehensive programs. But overall, I would say that enthusiasm for this type of low-touch approach has been greatly diminished compared to a decade or so ago when there was a lot of excitement about that. Okay, so let me draw out a few lessons. So the first lesson I came away with is that institutions should focus on what they can do well and sustain. Since the ASAP evaluation came out about a decade ago, and that produced very impressive results, doubling graduation rates, that intervention was replicated in Ohio, and it's been replicated in other places. And it works across groups. So I think there's just a lot of evidence that this is an effective approach. And I think that institutions that think that they have the resources to field such an approach should strongly consider that. And there are the CUNY ASAP folks and MDRC sort of have some resources that they can draw on to try to do that. But I think that there are reasons to consider less than comprehensive programs still in light of that evidence. And the biggest one is that comprehensive programs are expensive, and mainly for that reason, they're difficult to sustain. We saw even in the Ohio replication, which was very successful, several of the campuses that participated in the pilot weren't able to continue the program after the pilot because of funding issues. And I'm going to just flag this without going too deep into it, but you can see in the report, it's pretty difficult in this literature to compare cost effectiveness across studies because of different ways that different studies approach counting up the costs. But I think if we focus on additional degrees or credits per dollar spent in a program, some less expensive interventions that have smaller effects will look cost effective. But of course the effects, it will be cheaper, but the effect will be smaller. Although ASAP in particular has been well implemented in other places, in general, we find that implementing interventions in new settings with fidelity is difficult. So I think for all these reasons, I think, just institutions really saying, okay, what is it that we think we can do well, and trying to make that happen is a good approach. Okay, lesson 2, strategies that induce students into more selective institutions are promising. So there is quite a bit of evidence that students are more likely to graduate if they attend a more selective institution. And I think this is true on different margins, on the 2-year 4 margin, and then moving up the selectivity ladder within the 4-year sector. Interventions that encourage students into more selective institutions are improve completion for those students. And so I do think this is a very promising strategy, especially because we have evidence that more disadvantaged students kind of benefit more from the resources that more selective institutions have than less disadvantaged students. So it makes sense to try to get more of those students into those types of institutions. But there are some limitations or caveats to this approach. So first, it's only possible to pursue this strategy if high quality affordable options are available. And I think, for some students, depending on where they live and depending on their academic background, that may or may not be the case. I think also when we're doing the cost accounting, thinking about this type of intervention versus other approaches, how do these high quality institutions get better outcomes? Well, we kind of don't know for sure. That's a little bit why we're here reviewing this, but they do spend more on instruction, on support services. So it may be that there's more resources in those institutions, and so the cost accounting should take account of the fact that when you induce a student into such an institution, there's more resources going with that. And finally, I think it's important to consider how, and to understand, which because I'm not sure we know, or I don't think we know, I don't know, how do institutions respond? So when, when a program or a policy induces a lower income student into a more selective institution, they need financial aid to attend that institution. So where does that financial aid come from? Well, there's some really rich institutions that, kind of can expand their financial aid budget. But most institutions have a fixed financial aid budget. So I do worry a little bit that if when such a student is induced into this higher quality institution, that they might be displacing another low income student who didn't have access to such a program. So I think, I do think this is a promising approach, but certainly if it were to be scaled more, we would need to think a lot about these other issues. Okay, so the third lesson, effectiveness of FAFSA, so the financial aid form, information and support, is limited by underlying complexity. So in the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of attention to FAFSA, the financial aid form itself, as a barrier to college enrollment and completion. There have been a lot of interventions that have tried to help students, remind students about FAFSA or help them complete it. And some of them have been successful, especially at getting the FAFSA completed, and sometimes that will have a downstream effect on enrollment or persistence. But I think that completing the FAFSA is not enough. There was sort of a hope that you get students to complete the FAFSA, then they'll learn about the financial aid that they're eligible for, and that will help with the affordability problem, or at least clarify what the cost will be. But I think that students need to know how they will pay for college earlier, like before it's time to apply, or ideally even earlier. So this, if you get students to complete FAFSA, they're still dealing with a situation where they have to decide what their application portfolio is, before they have a good idea of what the financial aid will be. And I think even though as economists of education have been beating the drum that the net price of college is not the same as the sticker price, I think many students have not received that message, and or they don't believe it. So it providing sort of reliable information earlier, maybe ideally a guarantee, I think would be more effective. So I think we should look for ways to move the aid determination earlier. This might have to be a state or federal policy. Maybe institutions could do it, but I think we would get more bang for our financial aid buck if students could actually count on it, because that, when it's uncertain, it may not move enrollment as much as otherwise. And I think this could potentially be particularly effective if combined with direct admissions. So direct admissions is where an institution will use administrative data from the K-12 system on grades and or test scores, and admit a student without them having to apply. This is a fairly new, there's a bit of research on it, but it's a fairly new area. But I think if you could imagine a student receives early in their senior year something that's like, for the public institutions in your state, you've been admitted to these ones, or you have a high chance of being admitted, and here's how much financial aid it will cost you, and how much financial aid you'll get, and here's what it will cost you to attend, that could help improve college enrollment. I think it would be better if it was even earlier, like earlier in high school, so that students can imagine, they can start to imagine okay, this is something that can happen. But I think that's a heavier lift. And so as with the previous point, the sort of pricing transparency approach only works if the prices are actually reasonable. So if you provide students information earlier and what they find out is like, oh, this actually is indeed really expensive, then, that's not going to help. And I think there's underappreciated variation across states in this factor. So I think it would be useful to have more on that. Okay, so there has been a lot done in this literature and a lot learned. I'm just going to mention a few areas where I think more research could be helpful. So one is on the question of what are the best ways to encourage students to use support services. So you see many interventions where the take-up of services is low, and that is sometimes cited as a reason that the intervention didn't work. My read is that it is probably promising to require students or incentivize them with small payments or something, at least a bit, to take up services. But I think it's also possible that the students don't find the services valuable, and that's why they don't take them up. So I think more work on that would be helpful. So something that came up a lot in the discussions is, well, it would be much better to simplify some of these procedures than to develop interventions to help students navigate them. And I think that that's true, and there's sort of evidence that if you remove certain small barriers, that can have effects on student success. But I think we really don't know how to do this. Why is it so hard to simplify, either at the institutional or at the policy level? So I think having more research on how to increase transparency, reduce complexity, and just to note that this is not going to be an RCT. You can't really study this kind of change in a randomized study, but I think it would be really valuable, so it's worth doing. Another area, like if we were talking about K-12 and how students are succeeding academically or not in K-12, we would be talking a lot about teachers. That is largely absent from this discussion outside of developmental education, I would say. And there have been a couple of interventions, one where faculty are encouraged to send messages to students that have had some effects on students' outcomes. There is a study looking at variation in community college instructor quality that finds that can have important downstream effects. So I think just kind of thinking about what role faculty could play. I used to be faculty, so I understand it's extremely hard to get them to do anything, but that they don't want to do. But I think they're maybe looking for ways to make it easier, so that faculty know what's useful and make it easier for them to do evidence-based practices. This is something that I think everybody who's working on these studies wants to do. And that's look at how these programs affect long-run outcomes. But I think it is really important to do as much as possible to follow students over time and look for effects on wages or employment. That is hard to do both because it takes a long time, you have to match the data, but also the kind of sizes of effects you would expect to see on wages sort of might not be big enough to see in the studies of the size that we have. And sometimes you can't make the study bigger because actually the limitation is how many students are, just available to participate. So this is a challenge, but I think, we need to keep pushing on it. And I have one small suggestion, which is that I think it could be useful to draw on credit report data for long-run outcomes to look at, that could potentially look at student loan outcomes or measures of financial distress, and particularly given that some of the motivation around college success programs is this concern that students who do some college but don't complete a degree have poor financial outcomes. I think looking at that directly makes a lot of sense, and I think I haven't investigated deeply, but I think it could be possible from a technical perspective. And finally, I think we need more thinking and also ideally more research about the value of credits that don't lead to a credential. So you have even very successful programs like ASAP leave half of students not completing their degree. Students taking a very long time to complete their degrees, even when they do complete. And sometimes you have interventions where you get sort of reasonable increases in credit accumulation that don't lead to completion, or you can have the opposite where you kind of get more completion but not a lot more credit accumulation. And so I think understanding what is the value of that, whether those credits are human capital building in some sense, I think is very important. I do think that you can get to a point where, if you're moving the completion rate from 10 to 12, and you don't think that the credits have value without completion, there's kind of a question of why, whether this is a good program for the student to be pursuing. Okay, a few concluding thoughts. So I really came away from this thinking that there are, some structural problems that are going to limit progress in this area. In particular, many post-secondary institutions, especially community colleges and open access four-year institutions, simply don't have enough resources to provide the kind of support the students would need to serve them effectively. And that's kind of just a fact of the situation. And on the access side, I think, effectiveness is going to be limited by the availability of high quality, affordable options at some point, although I think there's some gains to be made. But I do think the evidence suggests we can achieve income rental improvements, and it's very important to do that. And there's already, as my research assistants also will attest, keeping up with the studies coming out in this area, even while we were working on the report, was a lot. There's a lot of great research in the field and, a lot of work to draw on here. So I'll stop there, and I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion and want to thank them for coming. And I think we're going to have a quick change. Oh, yes, right there. Perfect.
Find our name tags. All right. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to everybody for coming out. I am Catherine Meyer. I'm a fellow in the Governance Studies program here at Brookings, and I'm really grateful that Sarah invited me to moderate today's panel with our phenomenal panelists. I'll give them a quick introduction, and then we can dive into the meat. As Sarah was presenting, I thought we could use the next 45 minutes to pick any one of those bullet points to dive into. So we'll see what we can do here with some of my questions, but then leave lots of time for everybody in the audience. And then if folks at home have any questions, I think you can email events@brookings.edu if anything comes to mind. So excited to have our panelists. First up, we have Shen Robertson, who is the Senior Vice President for the University of North Carolina System. We're also joined by Michelle Domino, the Director of Education at Third Way. We have Ben Castleman, who's an Associate Professor of Public Policy and Education at UVA, wahoo wah, and then Sarah from the presentation. So let's just kick off. The presentation was, what does the evidence say on supporting students to and through? Love to get sort of initial reactions from the three of you. Shen, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I think Sarah's been sitting in some of our meetings in the system office because a lot of this resonates with us. Our president, President Hans, has given us the charge at the system office to simplify, simplify, simplify. Let's make it easier for students to access our institutions. And one way we're doing that, we're doing a new program called NC College Connect. This is a simplified application process for high school seniors in North Carolina. 70,000 North Carolina high school seniors got a letter in October saying that they are eligible for this program, the simplified application program at our institutions. That's coupled with our new Next NC scholarship, which is a need-based aid program for students and families with AGIs of less than $80,000. They are guaranteed at least $5,000 to come to one of our institutions, right? So this NC College Connect program and Next NC, we feel like those two together is a good message and a message to North Carolina students and families that they need to hear. I am really excited about this program and other direct admissions programs about what it means for students with 2.8 and 2.9 GPAs and first-gen students who may not believe that they can come to one of our institutions. So getting that information out there is really important and really powerful. So really looking forward to seeing the effects of that. We're also really interested in transfer students, and I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing for transfer students later. But we are really thinking about how we get information in front of students early while they're at the community college about the courses they need to take to come into our institutions. Really important. So we have new transfer guides that lay that out clearly. We're also thinking about how we streamline the transcript review process. We know that that can be very cumbersome for students, and we're trying to streamline that so students can get that information quicker so that they can make a knowledgeable choice about their college. So really excited about this conversation and really excited to hear that in North Carolina we're on the right track.
That's great. Yeah. Michelle?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Sarah, for this terrific research. So much of the work that we're doing at Third Way is focused on student outcomes and how we improve students' chances of success as they move through their college education. And something we see come up time and time again is this question of sustainability when we think about these programs. So really glad to see that that is reflected in this report and the research you've done as well. And I think within that discussion about sustainability, it's so important that we broaden it out to think about all of the ways in which sustainability appears. Financial resources are typically top of mind and one of the biggest barriers to implementing some of these comprehensive programs in particular, but really any big student success initiative. But there's so many other facets to that too. When we think about sustainability, we're also thinking about your capacity as an institution or a system, your staffing plan to have long-term invested staff members who have expertise in these areas to deliver the programs. We're thinking about the elements of your support from your state legislature if you're getting state funding. So your government affairs apparatus comes into play, your external affairs if you're working with private funders, your leadership at the institution or system level. Do they have the buy-in to be able to advocate for these programs, to sustain them long term, to continue to maintain the resources, and how that factors into thinking about really what is sometimes culture change at the institution or the system to be investing full scale in student success and thinking about all of the ways in which that will trickle out into the ways that you're providing services for your students.
That's great. Ben?
Well, thanks for the chance to be here, and thanks for all the insights in the report. Thinking across some of the themes that Sarah talked about, what, in my view, distinguishes the advising and coaching and informational and nudge interventions that are effective are those which engage students in trusted, human-centric, and sustained relationships. When we look at the advising research of programs that are generating, 20, 30% relative increases in bachelor's degree attainment, they are the ones that are connecting students to one-on-one advising 10, 15 hours during senior year alone to really, address this complexity and make informed choices that are right for the student and the family. And to the extent that we had earlier work on nudge-based approaches that had more modest effects, but still effects on access, they were the ones that were reconnecting students to people they already knew, advisors they already worked with, school counselors they already knew. And where I think the advising interventions have been less effective is, in models that are not set up for sustained relationships. One person across a high school supposed to work 9th through 12th grade who just can't put in enough time. And where much of the nudging work has fallen flat, I think, is either there's just no advising on the back end, or it's structured in a way that the nudges or information is coming from someone the students don't have a relationship with or trust in, and the advisors don't have the capacity to support them. And so, eyes wide open to the resource constraints about providing trusted, sustained human relationships. But I think that's part of what makes ASAP successful. It's part of what makes a program like Bottom Line successful. And that, to me, is a theme, especially post-pandemic, where we know a lot of young people are struggling with isolation and various mental health issues. I see the most promise in the approaches that are providing trusted, sustained, human-centric solutions.
I think that's a great transition to dive in a little bit more to those comprehensive programs, because I think not only do things like CUNY ASAP include a big bundle of supports, but they're very deeply integrated into the experience of the college. And I know, Sean, in North Carolina, you all are looking at some replications, and I'm curious what that implementation has looked like there.
Yeah, so in North Carolina, we're doing our own replication of the CUNY ASAP program. For four-year institutions, it's called ACE. Ours is focused on transfer students, so TRACE. And, and this is for students who are transferring from a North Carolina community college. We're doing a pilot right now with 3 of our institutions. We're doing an RCT. And students get a tuition gap scholarship, textbook assistance, so $300 a semester for textbooks. And in CUNY, of course, they get the MetroCard. MetroCard doesn't really work in North Carolina, so we do a $100 monthly incentive. So if students meet with their advisor, if they do trace activities, if they go to the career services, they get the $100 incentive. We just wrapped up our pilot year. Again, we're in the RCT, but the pilot is showing that these students are attempting and completing more hours. They're more likely to be on track to graduation. They have higher GPAs. Since this is an RCT, is being implemented very regimented across all 3 of our institutions, but we are starting to think about sustainability and what it looks like. And so institutions are already thinking about how they keep this going and what it will look like for them. And also how they can take what they've learned through TRACE to change advising across the institution. It is a very intensive program. It is, kind of expensive, but there are pieces of that program that would be beneficial to all students that are thinking about that. We're also having conversations about at the North Carolina Community College system about them creating their own program. So creating a CUNY ASAP program at the North Carolina Community College that would lead to the TRACE program, right? So students will get the ASAP benefits while they're at the community college and come over to our program. Our TRACE advisors will work with students while they're at the community college. Our TRACE students will go and talk to students while they're at the community college. And that way, when they come to our institution, they already feel like they have a community. They already feel like they belong. So this program is really taking off in North Carolina. We're really excited about it.
Oh, that's terrific. I think Sarah's report highlights there are a lot of interventions that work. And while there's maybe no silver bullet of a particular category of interventions, there are some very evidence-driven policies that have consistent results, like ASAP, but many of the advising programs as well. How do we think about supporting those programs with strong evidence and making sure that institutions are then able to implement those programs, institutions or systems? Maybe if you want to talk about UNC, I know, Michelle, you've done a lot of work on thinking about scale. Ben, you've certainly advised a lot of institutions about kind of what they should adopt. Happy to kind of take it down the row as anybody wants to respond.
Yeah, so I'll flag. In 2018, we started this program called Student Success Innovation Lab. We raised funding from philanthropic sources to provide funding to our institutions to implement our scale student success interventions. Need to be evidence-based, so something from a peer-reviewed journal that they would like to try. And we pair them with the faculty member from another institution to do the evaluation. So it's a third-party evaluation. It's also a good opportunity for us to invest in our faculty. They get to spend time with student success professionals. They also get to inform system policy. And we've seen some really good results from that. One program, a completion assistance program, of course, Georgia State was known for that years ago. Several of our institutions wanted to try it. We funded them to try it. It worked. We went to the General Assembly, and they provided funding for us that we can scale it across several of our institutions. So it's really important for the system to invest in our institutions to try new things and to give them the supports they need to evaluate what's working so they can figure out what's working and continue to do it and scale it and stop doing what isn't. So really excited about the effects that that's having at our institutions.
And then I think in addition to the state and system level work, there is also a role for the federal government to play in this effort and that they're increasingly interested in playing. One example of this is the Post-Secondary Student Success Grant Program, which is a fairly new initiative run through the Department of Education. Was first funded in fiscal year 2022 and has since had 3 years of funding, about $100 million in grants that have gone out to over 20 institutions to either be investing in work that they're already doing and scaling it up, moving it to other institutions within a system, and be continuing to build the evidence base. So what's really exciting about this program in particular is that it's very targeted to institutions that have high need students who are working on increasing their graduation rates for those student populations, and that it has evidence requirements. So applicants are required to show a rationale for the project that they're undertaking or a body of existing evidence that gives some credence to the funding having real value and return on investment in those programs and in those expansion efforts. So this is another way that the federal government is thinking about how do we provide almost seed funding for some of these interventions to allow institutions to build their mechanisms for delivering those interventions, to continue to expand the work that they're doing, to bring it to other campuses in their systems, and then think about longer term how they can sustain those initiatives on their campuses and in their communities. So we've heard from some grantees that this is funding continuing work that will then allow them to tap into further state funds to be able to create a longer term approach, that some of them have partnered with private foundations to get additional support or to have additional evaluation measures that are done through that. So what's really been appealing to policymakers that we've spoken with is that there is a clear ROI investment for them here, that they can see that they are putting federal funding toward this. And right now it's a very modest amount of federal dollars that are going towards these grants and a small number of grants that have been funded, but they know that the money that they're putting in has a very high likelihood of delivering some returns and being able to allow them to reach the outcomes that they want in helping more students graduate. So it's been really exciting to see that there's a lot of bipartisan support for this. This originally came out of the Biden administration, but was also included in Republican House and Education and Workforce Committee Chair Virginia Fox's higher ed legislation. So we have both sides of the aisle that are really interested in supporting these types of initiatives and see the need for some federal funding to help boost that up and allow more institutions to get in on some of these interventions.
In some ways, I would speak across both Sean and Michelle's points. I mean, I love to hear about the Student Success Innovation Lab. I think that's fantastic. We've been very fortunate to have long-term partnerships with state higher education systems in Virginia and Tennessee at the community college level. And the reason I think those are so important is that we've been able to pilot interventions at the campus level, sometimes even course section level, but working very closely with state systems. So if strategies work, it's the systems that have the connective tissue to other institutions to say, look, this institution, Piedmont Virginia Community College, tried X seemed to work, how do we support you to diffuse this? But also some of what we do doesn't work, and that's also a very valuable role for state partners to say, you may have been wanting to invest in X doesn't seem to be as effective, you might want to shift scarce resource and time elsewhere. And I do think there's been, certainly IAS has provided broadly relevant funding support for these kinds of research policy partnerships, but I think that's another federal role that could have a very state-based focus, which could align with some of the priorities of an upcoming administration, and lead to effective state-based solutions focused on college access and success.
Sarah, anything you wanted to say on that?
I guess I just was listening to this. I was curious, like, what is the right level to, to try to intervene, and also should it be an intervention, or how can we, should we be thinking about how to make these things more integrated as part of the normal college experience or high school experience for access, or does that, will that become watered down, or so this trade-off between kind of implementing something as an intervention versus trying to make it really kind of fundamental to the core instruction. I'm just curious if just listening to you, that question came to my mind.
I mean, I'll say for the Student Success Lab, we funded an advising intervention at one of our institutions that was targeted towards a specific group of students. But they learned so much about advising through that they changed the way they do advising across the whole institution. I think, technology has changed the way we do advising. An advisor doesn't have to sit in a room with the student for 15 minutes to plan their schedule. Like, there are tools out there that can do that now. And now advisors can spend more time with students talking about financial challenges or mental health and everything else, and think about the whole student. And so thinking about how we take things that are pilots, but how it can be scaled across the entire institution to be more effective for all of our students.
Yeah, my personal view is that I think consistent with what Sean said, I think the most evidence-based effective strategies are ones that operate locally and then replicate or clone or whatever word we want to use across additional settings. Whereas for all the right reasons, when we've tried to implement strategies at large scale, remote advising, large scale texting campaigns or informational campaigns, we see very small or very precisely estimated null effects. And so, again, we are going to a point the report makes, I think, really well, we are going to continue to confront this tension between efficacy and scale. That's not unique to post-secondary, right, of course. But to the extent we want to privilege what works, at least that's my personal view, I'd rather invest time in strategies that can have substantial effect. I think those are more likely to be done with an institution in the system that then can expand it across the institution, and then partner institutions can try and take it up and do something similar.
I mean, I wonder if this mechanism whereby by developing the institution or adapting it locally, that like you are building the human capital of doing the intervention locally, whereas if you like buy the intervention, it's not going to work because you're not getting that, it's not like being integrated into, or, it's not right for the setting.
I think one thing that strikes me with this literature is that many of these interventions are grappling just with inherent income inequality and resource gaps that students have. When we think about college advising interventions, in many ways, it's replacing a helicopter parent that many more affluent students have. When we think about comprehensive advising programs like CUNY ASAP, it's replacing the very comprehensive experience of a highly selective institution where, graduation rates are well into the high 90s. And I think, Sarah brings this point up towards the end of the report and the presentation. Where do we strike the balance between matching students to institutions where they're going to do well versus investing in improving the experience and the outcomes of institutions that don't have as high sort of completion rates right now? And obviously, capacity is one of the key constraints to making that decision. But I'm curious everyone's reactions sort of on how much of this is, trying to support students through versus changing institutions that are available to students or the quality of institutions.
I think in so much as our collective North Star is, to have every student have an opportunity to succeed in the school that they are attending, it's somewhat of a both and in the moment that we're in and the constraints that we have in the system. On the one hand, I think there, is really a need for institutions to be thinking comprehensively about their student body, the populations that they're serving, which types of interventions in which combinations would best address the needs that they're seeing from those particular students, and be doing everything they can to invest the resources in that infrastructure to support them. On the other hand, if you're thinking about an institution itself or a state system that has an authorizing role in approving programs, or the federal government, which has gatekeeping functions as part of its authority to distribute federal student aid, you also have a role to play in the accountability piece of that, of saying, what are our bottom lines for what we are accepting of the quality of outcomes that students are receiving at certain programs and institutions, and what do we do when programs or institutions are actually falling below that line and not delivering results for students. So I think that that's an important role that should be leaned on more, in my opinion, to be able to really be saying we have concrete standards, and if programs and institutions are not meeting those baseline measures of quality, they may not receive this state or federal funding, or this program may need to close if it's really delivering bottom of the barrel outcomes. And then within the institutions to be thinking about, we are serving this population of students who have come to us, and how do we do absolutely everything we can to make that a positive and fruitful experience for them.
I'm curious, Sarah's view, having thought a lot about this too. I guess I see more promise on the quality shift margin. I think you're entirely right in the report to both point out there are many students in the country who don't have nearby quality options, but there are also many who do, that are relatively geographically proximate. And I 100% agree, we need to learn more about, I think, displacement in particular, because we don't get to study that often in the context of our experiments. But I think there are students for whom the movement can be from the extensive margin of not going at all to a regional 4-year that's 40, 50 miles from where they live. or from a community college to that same institution, where they are going to have more institutional resources devoted, and it doesn't, there are some challenges within institution around like who's paying for the kind of incremental increases in financial aid, but it doesn't mean how do we shift substantially more dollars to community colleges or more broad access 4 years. I 1,000% think that's important. That also strikes me as a much bigger structural challenge, and I think there is room within the system to support students. And I think it's really important to recognize, this builds on a point Catherine said, that there are students at the very top of the distribution academically and low income who can kind of have their cake and eat it too, right? They can go to tremendous institutions and pay very little. But for many students in the middle of the distribution, it's really challenging to optimize on quality and affordability, let alone other preferences, right? You can hold constant graduation rate and the net price varies substantially. You can do it the other way. And I think that speaks to why advising interventions that, again, provide sustained human-centric relationships can help optimize a quality shift, right? Because it's solving what is a complex informational challenge.
Yeah, I think just to briefly follow up, I really think I don't know. Like how, basically, the question is like, how far could we get by kind of shifting students around to change who's where? And the advising interventions to do that are pretty expensive. So, but I think the 2-year, 4-year margin. There's a lot of evidence that students benefit from going to a 4-year instead of a 2-year, not just from advising programs, but from other contexts. So I think I do agree that that's certainly for marginal changes that is important. I think also like there could be a lot of benefit to just advising students out of the worst situations, and I think we need to kind of have it's not that aspirational, but like a North Star that students shouldn't be made worse off by attempting post-secondary education. And some students should try it out. I also think it's important not to think that it's always a failure that a student tried college and didn't complete. There's I think we should have a system where students sometimes try it out because they're not sure whether it's for them or what they want to do. And then some of them will choose not to continue, and that'll be the right decision. But sort of other policies around accountability that I think Michelle is getting at, and and also around higher ed finance, financial aid, student loan system, and things like that that can sort of help ensure that students who try some post-secondary education aren't but don't complete aren't suffering too much. I mean, I also work on K-12, and I sort of think where we spent is $100,000 for you to be educated through 12th grade, and maybe letting students have access to another $5,000 to try out post-secondary education that doesn't work without that kind of like following them around for the rest of their lives, wrecking their their financial lives, like is something that we should try to accommodate. So I think I guess that was a long answer, but I'll stop there.
You asked a question about the value of those credits when a student does. Like, I think it's on us as institutions to think more innovatively about those credits and like start offering micro credentials, right? So a student doesn't spend 3 years in one of our programs in one of our schools and don't come out with anything. Think about reverse transfers, like working with the community colleges, like they may have enough credits to get an associate's degree, right? So I think part of it's on us to think about how we can get those students some form of a credential that may lead to something else. So think about how those stackable credentials can also support those students.
All right. I knew we were going to run out of time. We're not out of time yet. We've got some time for audience questions, and I'm going to pivot to one that we had submitted online ahead of time, but everybody in the room start thinking about what you want to ask, which I think gets at this, as we've been starting talking about transfer students. There were a lot of questions online about heterogeneity of effects, audience members wondering, what do we know about best practices for tribal students, for ELL students, for students with disabilities, for different racial backgrounds. I'm curious you all's thoughts on maybe from the researcher perspective, what do we know about the relative benefits for different groups of students, and then more on the policy and practice side, how do we do this trade-off between targeted programs for student groups as opposed to general programs that you hope will, serve and work for everyone and might be easier to implement? Maybe we'll take the research question first.
So I think that on sort of heterogeneity of effects, I do think there's a lot of limitation in the research that basically everybody wants to look at for differences across groups, and then the samples aren't big enough to really conclude much from that. I think there was this conventional wisdom that that women benefited more from interventions than men, but that's not to me completely obvious that that's consistent in this setting. So I think, yeah, like we kind of don't know, but I'll point to a couple things where I think you can think about who doesn't have other support. So particularly in the access space, it's easy to reason about who, based on their school setting or their family setting, is unlikely to be getting other support. And so that's going to be, I think there'll be more likely to be effects there. And I think Hispanic students tend to fall in that category more often. So that from an access targeting perspective, I think that is that's a promising group, especially students who maybe Spanish is the first language in the home. So you can imagine that the parents don't have a lot of experience with the U.S. system. So let me stop with that.
I mean, I'll mention transfer students again. I mean, really, excuse me, really passionate about transfer in community colleges because community colleges serve as the first step to post-secondary education for so many low-income students, first-generation college students, rural students. And so making sure that they have a good experience there that leads to one of our four-year institutions. I think something we learned through TRACE is the importance of orientation for transfer students, right? Like we think just because they spent time on a college campus that they should know how to navigate our campus. And so treating those students and giving them the same kind of orientation that we give first-year students is really important and something we're thinking about. At the policy level, there's so much that we could and should do to help remove those policy barriers for students. Like I said, the transcript review process. So thinking about how we can do both of those things at the institutional level on the practice side, but also at the system level, how we can help our institutions get out of their own way so that they can help those students.
One thing I would add on the policy level as well, I think for institutions or state systems that might be thinking about the targeted piece of that versus interventions that could be supporting an entire campus, is that there are differences across states in terms of where there is appetite to invest in these types of institutions. Some state environments may be open to targeted interventions that are focused specifically on populations that have high need, that face higher barriers, and may be able to invest their resources in a very cost-effective and smart way there. Other states may be facing constraints in political dialogues where they are going to only receive support if they're thinking about it in a broader way. So I think that there's a lot of nuances there in how states and system offices are currently approaching those conversations. And one other consideration is that for some institutions, those populations are actually the same. There's a lot of overlap. If you're thinking about a smaller institution and you have 85% of your students are Pell Grant recipients, you may be thinking about this in a different way where having targeted interventions would really mean, how do we apply this to a whole campus or a whole college? And that's an area too where I think that policymakers really need to be thinking about the conversations they have around what is adequate funding that we're providing to these institutions to be able to meet the needs of the student bodies that they're serving, most of whom we know are coming from their local communities, since students are not traveling all that far to go to school.
I think just to follow up quickly on a point there, I think this question about, targeting based on institutions that have like a high share of students with high needs is a good idea because, sometimes you end up with these targeted things and then that's part of what leads to complexity is that, you've sliced things up, this type of person gonna get this, and this is a problem like across social programs. And then, that's part of what's contributing to the complexity. So I think like the idea of at institutions where, you're basically serving like a pretty high need population, trying to have something that's targeted at the institution level makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. As you said, all social policies, particularly things like financial aid, when we think about the relative value of things like free, promise, guarantee programs as opposed to targeted scholarships. All right, I'll stop asking questions for a little bit and see who in the audience wants to jump in. Ben?
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm Ben Woldowski.
We're going to give you a mic.
Thanks very much. I'm Ben Moldavsky. I'm a visiting fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I have a question. It's kind of a leading question, but it goes back to where Sarah began about the demonstrated value of college. I guess I wonder whether all of the very, intriguing sort of incremental progress and initiatives that you're exploring are undermined by a broader public discussion that I see every single day, all about the value of hiring for skills, which many governors and employers have embraced, at least in theory. The big discussion, there's been big reports in the last year about the supposed problem of underemployment for college graduates. There was just another study by Burning Glass a couple weeks ago about the importance of strong first jobs for people who are graduating from high school who aren't going to college, and how we need to make sure they're taking the right kinds of jobs for upward mobility, as opposed to what seems obvious to me, going to higher education for upward mobility. So can you just put this in the context of this broader public skepticism about college, and whether all of these efforts you're describing are being sidetracked or even undermined by this deep skepticism about whether college is even worthwhile?
So I'll just say I feel very worried about this. So there's a lot of problems in higher education, and we need to all be working on them. And I think there's some low-value programs that it's not fair that we're encouraging students into them, explicitly and implicitly. So I think there's problems, but this like growing idea that it's not even worth it to go to college, especially if you have to borrow, I think it's really damaging. And I worry about a situation where sort of higher income people who, themselves went to college, they say that, but send their kids to college, and, the divide is opening up. So I think, but, at the same time, some of these, I think, labor market policies that, reduce specific degree requirements for jobs and things like that, I think that those are good ideas, for the state to say, like, we're not going to require a BA for all these jobs. Like, I think, that's healthy for the labor market. But I think this narrative that college isn't even worth it anymore, I think is not evidence-based. And I worry about, how it could affect inequality in the future. I don't know if other people.
I'll let others jump in, but it's not only not evidence-based, it's the opposite of evidence, which is that college have only increased over time relative to people who only have
I completely agree. Like, yes, college can be valuable for a lot of people, full stop. And there are real margins that tried to go to college and were not successful, or didn't access college, who are struggling economically, who I think we need shorter term, workforce training programs for, that lead to high demand skills. I think Virginia's Fast Forward program is a really effective example of this. I also think the population of folks who went to college, maybe pursued a program of study, got a degree, but are struggling to find meaningful, stable employment, meaningful earnings, is real. Like, there's a program that operates in New York, in the Bay Area, called Co-op Careers, which is providing digital skills training with cohort and coach-based support for college graduates who are under or unemployed. And so I don't see these as, personally, I very much take your question, Ben, and it's great to see you. But I think we do need innovation for these populations as well, whether it's individuals who never went or did not get sufficient credentialing or training from a college, or folks who did, and for whatever set of reasons, that has not led to sufficient opportunity.
Mm-hmm. We've done a lot of polling on value at Third Way also, and I think one nuance that we've seen come through is that a vast majority of the folks that we've polled still see the value in a college degree, but they see it as less attainable for them than ever before. And I think that's an important distinction in a few ways. One being that it comes back to some of the affordability conversations around how we've done a great job in increasing access to college, increasing the college going rate. Now students are looking at the prices that they're being charged and thinking about those economic outcomes, thinking about the other side. Will I see a return on this massive amount that I'm spending, especially as we've created the conditions for more students from lower and middle income backgrounds to be entering institutions. It's also dovetailing with a lot of broader public trust in institutions questions that I think are probably bigger than the scope of what we're discussing today. But I think that one element to tie it back to some of these student success programs and initiatives is that schools that do this really well are able to say for the students that are coming in that we believe in you, we can get you through. And they're showing that commitment in a really visible way when you're having high touch advising, when you're having folks at the institution that care about the students. So students do still see that there's a lot of value in going to college. And I think it's incredibly important when they're getting there that they see that investment in them reflected, and they see that this is a place that is able to focus on their success and help them get through, and that helps to kind of restore some pieces of that trust.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh,
Question. Hello, my name is Alexandra Bolden, and I'm a program specialist at the United States Department of Education. And I was wondering if you all had seen evidence of institutions using and scaling up federal programs such as the TRIO, Upward Bound, Talent Search, Student Support Services, as well as a program that's near and dear to my heart, the Basic Needs Program.
So briefly, there's not a lot of good evaluation of the federal TRIO programs, which are access programs, and we spend over $1 billion on them. So there was an evaluation of Upward Bound, which if any of you ever have to try to follow the back and forth about the evaluation and the objections and the rejoinder, and so I think it's fair to say that the findings from that study, which an Upward Bound is an expensive program, it costs about $15,000 a student, are fairly mixed. So I think, again, not to say that things don't work because we don't have studies of them, but I think it's unfortunate actually that we don't have better studies of the federal access programs.
We have a state Gear Up grant in North Carolina, and we've taken the approach of investing in programs that we know work, right? So we invest in college advising corps. We have a lot of a college advising corps who are advisors who are working in underserved districts in North Carolina. We added onto that, we expanded that program and put Gear Up coaches in our institutions. So those students, they get the advising and the support while they're in high school, and they get a student success coach their first year when they're at our institutions. But yeah, we invest in evidence, and college advising corps is one of those that works.
other questions?
Hi, my name is Tracy Nahida. I'm with UNICEF USA. So years ago, I managed a federal teacher incentive fund project with 23 schools in Appalachia. It was all centered around college and career readiness. But Sarah, you said something that was really important about giving students an opportunity without risk to take college courses in high school. Because a big thing that a major barrier that we were confronting was families. They didn't want their children to go away to college, or they were telling their children, are you too good? Is that why you're going? And this was across the board, we were hearing this in school districts. So this was giving students an opportunity to take those classes, those college classes in high school, and demonstrate not only to their families, but to themselves that they could, meet that rigor and also get college credit at no cost. So they could enter college, kind of with that under their belt and get the confidence of their parents too. So thank you for making that comment. I think that's an important part of this conversation.
Yeah, I'll just briefly, in the discussions that I held with experts, one of the interesting things when we were talking about the scope, a lot of people were saying, dual enrollment or early college high school should be part of it. And I was like, well, that's a K-12 curricular question, so that's out of scope. But one of the things that people said is it's kind of a type of information intervention, and that so information interventions that sort of send you a piece of paper saying there'll be financial aid, or you can go to college. That is not that people don't take in that. I think they can't take in that information now. Maybe with a more personalized advising, then that information can sink in. So I think the early college high school model has been evaluated and has been successful at promoting college access and completion. But I think it's interesting to think about like that that particular approach, but just also other ways that students might need to experience something to take in the information about, sort of like whether their college material, what it will be like, and as you mentioned, also for their family. So thanks for bringing that up.
I'll say we have a robust dual enrollment early college high school program in North Carolina. One of our community colleges is actually trying out a program where the parent can take a course as well. So not only showing the student that they're college material, but also showing the parent that they are too, and there's still time for them to do that.
All right, we are just about at time. Happy to give everybody one last word on what's next. So we have a sense of what the evidence says so far. What do we as people who care deeply about helping students get to and through college and get a return on that do next? Whether that is the research we need next, what systems need to do, what policy needs to happen. Sarah, you have the advantage.
I'm like, oh no, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I guess as the researcher, I will. I think there is a lot that's been learned and is being implemented, and this kind of work is being done effectively. But I think there are a lot of open questions, and it's worth sort of continuing to chip away at it. I think what you said about there's not a silver bullet, that is true actually in very many policy areas, including this one. And so I think just continuing to chip away and trying to learn about what is effective is next steps.
I would turn to one of the questions, or one of the opportunities you identified in the report, which is greater investigation of how to enhance faculty capacity to support students. We're in the middle of some, I think, pretty promising work in the Virginia Community College where we're providing instructors in gateway college level classes, so English composition, or college composition, or college algebra, with a combination of predictions of which students in their early term predictions of which students in their course might struggle to complete, and then dedicated tutoring and advising, embedded tutoring and advising, so taking some of the insights of high dosage tutoring from K-12 and trying to bring them into the community college context. And again, it's ongoing, it's early stage, but seeing some indication of potentially quite large impacts on academic success. So I share that just as an example to reinforce this broader suggestion the report makes about, I think particularly at our community colleges and our broad access institutions, how to enhance instructors' ability to support students without adding more to their plates, because their teaching loads and everything else are much higher than for those of us at more research-intensive universities.
I think there's really an ongoing need for advocacy and storytelling. State and federal policymakers who make a lot of these decisions about funding and which initiatives are able to receive funding, they want to hear from their constituents. So institutions in their districts or states, students who are benefiting from these programs, those are the folks who can really demonstrate the lasting effects that they're having. And being able to go to them directly and share stories of impact is really meaningful in continuing to build up the body of evidence in this space.
Yeah. As we said, there's a lot of great research already out here. I'm thinking about how do we bridge that gap between the research and the policy and the practice that's happening. So how can we get that good research in the hands of policymakers and student success professionals so that they can act on that research?
Terrific. All right, we're gonna hit the timer exactly right. So I get a gold star. Thank you all so much for coming out today. Let's keep the conversation going and thank all of our panelists for joining us.